The little girl didn't speak. She just stared at Chuck, as if she already knew he was the last person who could save her. And in that look was a silent cry for help the whole bus pretended not to see. That morning was colder than most. Fallen maple leaves blanketed the road to the bus stop, soaked in dew, painted in faded amber like the color of old memories. Dawn hadn't fully broken. No one spoke. The number 17 bus that cut through the industrial zone in the city's south rolled along just as it always had, worn down, creaky, and quiet as a small-town morning in early autumn. In the last row sat an older man with silver hair and a weathered grey beard, wearing a scuffed leather coat. That man was Chuck Norris. He wasn't the legend people once called unstoppable. No more spotlight, no more guns, just a tired, aging soul carrying memories no one asked about, and he didn't care to share. He took this ride every morning, not because he had somewhere to go, but because being among nameless strangers reminded him he was still human, still here, still surviving. At the next stop, the bus doors screeched open. A young woman stepped in, bleached hair, loud clothes, and a cheap perfume that sliced through the silence like a slap. Dragging behind her was a frail black girl, maybe 7 years old, skinny as a twig. The child clutched a worn cloth bag. Her coat hung down to her knees, but something made Chuck pause as his eyes glanced over her. Underneath that coat, no pants, no socks, just loose rubber slippers like she'd been rushed out of somewhere. A breeze swept in through the cracked door. The girl shivered, but not a word came from her. Nobody on the bus seemed to notice. People turned away, eyes glued to their phones, earbuds in, drowning in sleep. But Chuck, he noticed, and what made him unable to look away was her gaze. She didn't cry, didn't fidget, didn't tremble like lost children often do. She just stared, right in front of him, as if she already knew him, as if she genuinely believed that she was the only one who might do something. That look wasn't begging. I didn't panic. It was a cry for help, silent, sharp as a knife to the heart. And in that moment, Chuck Norris knew, no matter how much he'd tried to disappear from this world, today he would have to rise. The bus jolted through uneven roads. The early morning streets through the industrial zone were never smooth. The woman picked a seat near the middle, pushing the girl into the far corner. She didn't fix the child's hair, didn't comfort her, just stared out the window, thumbing her phone endlessly. Chuck didn't look directly. He had experience. Back in his career days, he'd tailed human traffickers along the Mexican border, infiltrated organ harvesting networks. He knew the feeling of something being off, and this time that instinct rang loud, like a siren in the night. Several stops came and went. Each time someone boarded or exited, Chuck studied the woman's reactions. Every time, she clutched the child's wrist tighter, as if afraid someone might snatch her away. Just before a roadside rest stop, a young homeless man climbed aboard. He carried a plastic bag full of empty bottles and stale bread. When his eyes landed on the girl, he paused. Then, naturally, almost instinctively, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small chocolate bar, probably the last thing he had. He held it out with a smile. The girl's eyes lit up, just for a moment, but the woman swatted the man's hand away, her glare sharp as glass. She yanked the girl back so roughly that her head hit the seat's edge. No one said a word. But inside Chuck, something cracked. The woman pulled out her phone when the bus stopped and typed furiously. Chuck glanced in the reflection of the glass. She turned to the corner, trying to shield her screen, but a message lit up clear as day. Ready for delivery, 10 a.m. The chill that crept over him didn't come from the autumn air. Minutes later, the little girl dropped her cloth bag while climbing back into her seat. The woman didn't notice. Chuck bent down to pick it up and peeked inside, almost without thinking. a used syringe tube, a few blood-stained bandage strips, and a small folded piece of paper with a faint QR code. No toys, no snacks, no family photos. Nothing a child should carry. Chuck gripped the bag tightly. His mind spun with scenarios: trafficking, organ trade, medical testing. Still, all he had were guesses. He needed something more, a reason to intervene. And then fate gave him one. The overhead speaker crackled. The driver's voice came on, laced with wind. Police alert. Missing child report. Black female, approx age 7, believed abducted from a southern refugee shelter. It may be linked to illegal biomedical testing. If you see anything suspicious, stay seated and inform your route personnel. The bus went dead silent. The woman stiffened. She stood up at once and pulled the child to her feet. This time Chuck didn't wait. He stood. His voice, gravelly, low, worn like an old whetstone, cut through the silence. I think you ought to sit back down. She froze. Then, suddenly, she bolted. But in her haste, she yanked the child too hard. The girl slipped and fell hard. As the coat flared open, Chuck saw it. A rough surgical scar across her side, still stitched. No one performs surgery on a child there, unless they're taking something out. Chuck's eyes changed. That old glint returned. Cold steel, unshakable purpose, laced with compassion. He stepped forward, blocking them both. The woman staggered back, muttering something in a foreign language. Outside, a white medical van pulled up. A man in a white lab coat stepped out, flashing a hospital ID badge, phone in hand. Chuck saw him. He saw Chuck. They locked eyes. The man turned around and walked away. The van reversed down the street, vanishing into the mist, leaving behind only a breathless silence. Everyone on the bus remained frozen. No one moved. Even the driver looked away. It was as if they were all still deciding between silence and involvement. Then the woman's voice broke the silence, shaky, furious. "You don't know what you're interfering with. They'll kill me if I don't make the drop." Chuck didn't blink. His voice was calm, but something in it demanded obedience. "Then let me make something clear. If you take one more step with that girl, I'll be the one you must fear." She stopped. Her grip on the girl loosened. The child didn't scream. Didn't flinch. She simply turned and stepped behind Chuck, as if she had, finally, found where she was meant to be. A minute later, Chuck knelt in front of the little girl. For the first time he looked at her, not with suspicion, not as someone sizing up a threat, but with the eyes of a man who once lost his faith, and was now reminded of it. She was so small, barely half the size of his daughter back in the day. Her face was sun-worn, her eyes deep and dark like a well with no bottom. Not the kind of fear a normal child carries, but the kind you only get from seeing things you were never meant to see. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She shook her head. Didn't speak. But her gaze didn't leave his, like she was waiting for a different question, for a promise. Chuck sighed, then turned to the driver. "I'm taking her. She stays with me. You can call the cops or not, but if you do, use this number." He pulled a faded ID card from his coat pocket, Federal, internal code C61, and flashed it just long enough for the driver to register. The driver looked at it briefly, then gave a slow, silent nod. There was a rest stop just a few hundred feet ahead. Chuck escorted the woman off the bus, made her sit on a bench, and told her to wait for the police. Before returning, he stooped down and picked up the child's dropped bag. Back on the bus, he lifted the girl into his arms, light as a feather, and took her to the back seat. The bus remained silent. No one asked questions. No one spoke. But their eyes no longer looked away. For the rest of the ride, Chuck kept the girl close, one arm wrapped around her small shoulder, shielding her from a world that had only looked the other way. He thought of his last day in the service. The day he helped rescue 3 children from a biological prison camp in Eastern Europe. That was the day he promised himself, never again. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. It knows where to find you, especially where your heart's been broken. The girl didn't speak, just leaned into his chest, breathing steadily, but her tiny hand clutched his shirt and didn't let go. That night, Chuck didn't take her to the police. He knew better. With operations like this, the police were often where the monsters went to reclaim lost inventory once things cooled down. Instead, he drove them to a quiet part of the suburbs, to a small wooden cabin tucked beneath pine trees, a place he once owned, long forgotten by the rest of the world. The cabin was dusty with no internet, but it had a wood stove, clean blankets, and the one thing she needed most: safety. Chuck built a fire, heated a pot of soup from his old emergency stash. He placed the bowl in front of her. "Eat. No one's going to take you now." For the first time, her lips moved, not in words, but in a smile. Small, faint, but enough to warm the heart of a man who thought his had gone cold forever. In the days that followed, Chuck began to slowly gain her trust. He didn't ask much, he just talked about the pine forest outside, how to tie fishing lines, and the one time he caught a trout longer than his arm. She listened, still didn't speak, but each day she took a pencil and started to draw. Her sketches were haunting, figures with tubes in their arms, gas masks over their faces, wrists marked with barcode numbers. One day Chuck saw her draw herself, dressed in a hospital gown, a scar on her belly, a small chip embedded in her hand. She remembered everything, she just wasn't ready to say it out loud. On the 10th day, Chuck took her to a small private hospital where an old friend of his, Dr. Grant, still practiced. When the doctor examined the scar, he frowned. "Chuck, they didn't just take something, they implanted something. This is experimental tissue growth tech, not on the market. They're using undocumented migrant kids because no one comes looking for them." Chuck's fists clenched. He sat quietly for a long moment, then said, "Keep this off the books. I'm going to find out who's behind this." The girl finally began to speak in short, broken words. Her name was Imani. In Swahili it means faith. It wasn't the name her parents gave her, she didn't remember them, but the name a young aid worker had called her at the refugee camp, right before she was taken. Imani told her story through sketches, gestures, and trembling silence. Being separated from the other kids, loaded into a freezing van, injected, locked in white rooms, and each time the memory surfaced, she'd bury her head in Chuck's chest, as if his heartbeat was the only thing keeping her whole. Some memories don't go with sound, but with pain in the chest. For Chuck Norris, that memory struck when he saw Imani's tiny hand flinch every time a siren passed outside. After a minor procedure, Dr. Grant confirmed that the implant inside Imani was a prototype, a biological chip, no records, no serial numbers, no approval. "Chuck," he said gravely, "this isn't medicine. It's military tech. It tracks, stimulates tissue growth, and can modulate pain. This should not be in a child." Chuck sat still for a long time, gripping the edge of his coat. His rage wasn't just anger, it was helplessness. The world had changed. Evil no longer wore masks. It wore the name of progress. That night, Chuck booted up an old laptop and dug through firewalls using an outdated special ops program. It took 4 hours, but he cracked the QR code he'd found in Imani's bag. The result pointed to a project called Horizon Bloom. This name sounded like an environmental charity, but beneath it lay encrypted biomedical files linked to shadowy sponsors in Europe and East Asia. One chilling description read, "Artificial tissue growth acceleration via genetic scaffolding. Test subjects, undocumented migrant children." A shiver crept up Chuck's spine. He made his decision. No more silence. The next afternoon, Chuck brought Imani to the only person he could still trust with the truth, a former investigative journalist named Kate Ramos. Years ago, she and Chuck had taken down a cross-bedroom child trafficking ring. Now she ran a quiet coffee shop, far from headlines and danger, but she hadn't lost her instincts. When Chuck told her everything, she didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just said, "If you hadn't shown up, I'd never have known evil had changed its skin this way." They started digging. Kate tapped into old networks and cross-referenced missing child reports from the refugee camp in New Mexico. The result left them both stunned. In the last 3 months alone, at least 17 girls and 9 boys had vanished during the night. No investigations had gone beyond the initial report. Every child had 3 things in common: no family, no papers, and all had received aid from volunteers wearing Horizon Bloom logos. "This isn't testing, Chuck," Kate said grimly. "This is modern-day sacrifice dressed up as medical compassion." To flush them out, Kate leaked a fake report. A young girl with a biological implant, proof of Horizon Bloom's crimes, had escaped and was under protection by a retired federal agent. Chuck knew what this meant. He was the bait. And they bit. Less than 24 hours later, the cabin was breached. The sky was still dark. Wind whispered through the pine trees. Imani slept soundly in the back room. Chuck sat silently, a handgun on the table beside an old photo of him and his daughter. The door creaked. 2 men in black slipped in, guns silenced, comms in their ears. Not street thugs, trained, efficient. Chuck moved like a shadow. 3 movements. A sweep of the leg, a wrist twist, and a weapon changed hands. The second man raised his gun, but Chuck was already there, his hand clamped over the barrel, his eyes like frozen steel. "Tell me, who runs Horizon Bloom?" The man hesitated, then stammered, "We're not it, just one of the branches." Chuck tightened his grip. Then he dropped him to the floor, unconscious. Chuck brought Imani to the safest place left at dawn, Kate's home. She didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around the child. Imani looked up and whispered, for the first time since Chuck had saved her, "Will you come back, Uncle Chuck?" Chuck smiled gently, hand on her head. "No one's taking you from this world again." Then he left alone. He returned to his old base and accessed a dormant signal interference system to trace the chip's uplink. It pointed him to an abandoned mobile medical site, 20 miles from the border. When he arrived, the place looked post-apocalyptic. Tents, surgical gear, portable scanners, all hastily abandoned. It was clear they'd done this before. Inside a cold dungeon room, Chuck found case files for 6 children. Each had undergone Phase 2, organ extraction, chip enhancement. None had survived. Except Imani. As he turned to leave, a figure stepped from the trees, the doctor from the bus stop. "You don't understand," he began. "We'll save millions. That girl was a breakthrough. You should be proud. She's proof it works." Chuck said nothing. He simply raised his weapon. His voice was calm, cold. "Not hate, conviction. I'm not shooting you out of rage. I'm shooting you because I know if you live, you'll do it again." The shot rang out quietly. 5. A week later, Chuck returned to the cabin. Imani was waiting. She had drawn a new picture, her and Chuck, standing in a field of flowers. In the background, a small house with smoke rising from the chimney. No labs, no needles, no codes. Just peace. Epilogue. A moral lesson. There are people the world never remembers, but they're the ones who quietly hold back the darkness. Chuck Norris didn't return to glory. He didn't want it. All he wanted was one thing, to wake up each morning and hear Imani laugh. To know one small soul had not been forgotten. The final lesson? The world doesn't need more heroes. It needs people quiet enough to notice and brave enough to stand when no one else will. That winter came early. Snow blanketed the hills around the cabin where Chuck and Imani now lived. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The scent of cornbread drifted through the warm air. Imani sat on a wooden rocking chair, wrapped in a thick blanket, coloring a new picture. Beside her was one she'd finished that morning. An old bus in the snow. A little girl. A man with grey hair and a leather coat, standing between her and the world. "Uncle Chuck?" Imani's voice was soft. "I remember that bus. I remember your eyes. They weren't like other grown-ups." Chuck, chopping wood on the porch, paused. "Why's that?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes no longer clouded by fear. "Because your eyes didn't just see me. They saw through me, like you knew I was crying out, even when I didn't say a word." In the months that followed, their lives found a rhythm. Mornings are spent tending the small garden. Chuck taught Imani how to build fires, peel potatoes, and follow moss to find direction in the woods. Afternoons were quiet walks under tall trees, stories of old missions, and long talks by the river. Imani began telling her story, not with words, but through drawings. Dozens of them. Each sketch freed a memory. One showed a research facility, but in her version there was a wide open door. And under that doorway, an old man held the hand of a child, walking her out into the light. In early spring, Kate Ramos published a small, independently released book, Imani, The Children Who Weren't Seen. It included her investigation, Imani's drawings, and fragments of testimony. There were no headlines, no breaking news, but it spread quietly among doctors, teachers, caseworkers, and refugee volunteers. A retired teacher in Texas wrote, "It's been years since I read a cry for help that didn't come as a scream, but from the heart." A doctor in Oregon sent a small check with a note. So, a child out there knows. Someone remembers? After 1 year, Imani enrolled in school. A modest campus in a quiet suburb accepted her. No birth certificate needed, no ID. Chuck signed as her guardian. At enrollment, a teacher asked, should we list her under her official name or her new one? Chuck looked at Imani. She smiled. Her first one without fear. "Her name is Imani," he said, "and that's the truest thing I know." One afternoon, Chuck found Imani writing at the table. She didn't know he was behind her. He looked over her shoulder and saw, "I'm writing to my real parents, even though I don't know them. I want them to know I'm alive. I draw. And I have a new father now, Uncle Chuck. I hope if anyone ever loved me, they'll feel it in their heart, even if they never read this." Chuck stepped away quietly. His eyes were glassy as mountain dew. Early that summer, Imani brought a drawing to the kitchen table. She'd redrawn the bus ride from that first morning, the one where she curled up beside the woman who wasn't her mother. In the back of the bus, Chuck stared back at her. Beneath the picture, she'd written, "Sometimes, all it takes is one look to save a whole life." Chuck stared at it for a long while, and then nodded slowly. "And sometimes," he said, "one person standing up can change the rest of the world." That September, they held a small art show in the town library. All the pieces were Imani's. No mention of experiments, no mention of chips, just memory. Fragments of a journey, from darkness to light. One old man stood for a long time in front of the final painting, Chuck and Imani in a field of flowers, hand in hand. He whispered, "I was once a child nobody saw. Imani grew. Beautiful, strong, quiet. She studied art, then became an elementary art teacher. She worked with kids in tough places, not just teaching them how to hold a pencil, but how to tell their stories through color. With every child she shared a lesson, not in words, but through a simple idea. Someone saw me. And Chuck? He aged, of course. But something in his eyes remained untouched, an unbreakable will to protect good, even if the world had gone blind to it. He no longer fought, no longer chased, but every time he sat in the back of Imani's classroom, he knew one thing for sure: the greatest battle he ever fought, he had won. Not with fists, not with bullets, but with a choice to not look away. Failure reflection, life's truth. There is evil without disguise, and lives that cry out without sound. But there will always be eyes, quiet enough to see, and brave enough to stand. Chuck Norris didn't save the world. He saved one child. But for Imani, that was the whole world.